Now, let's focus on the dermis of our skin. And this is what represents the dermis. As you can see, the dermis is much thicker than the epidermis. And I like to look at the dermis in this model because this shows you better this area right here. So, can you notice that this part right here is the dermis, and this is the area that's in contact with the bottom layer of the epidermis, right? Now, if you're able to look at this in 3D, you'd see that these are little bumps in the dermis. And when we look at this in 3D, what happens is that those bumps look like nipples. And a nipple-like structure in anatomy is called papilla. Now, that papilla, that nipple-shaped structure, belongs to the dermis. So how do you think we name this area in the dermis? We name those dermal papilla. And the dermal papilla, they are very important because let's imagine if you had here the epidermis and underneath you had the dermis. So here's the epidermis and here is the dermis. And the surface in between the epidermis and the dermis, this area right here, would be flat. What happened if you had a friction? If you had a friction, those two layers, the epidermis and the dermis, they would easily split apart. And that does not happen. And that does not happen because we have these bumps, we have this dermal papilla. So the epidermis and the dermis, they interlock, and even if you have friction, they do not split apart unless you have lots of friction. Then they do separate. And then there is accumulation of interstitial fluid between the epidermis and the dermis. And you know how that is called? That's called having a blister. So literally, when you have a blister, that tells you that your epidermis and your dermis were separated, and then interstitial fluid was accumulated in between these two layers of the skin. Now look at this. We just defined that the top part of the dermis, these indentations that we see here in the dermis, that they look like nipples, are named dermal papilla, correct? So each of these bumps is a dermal papilla. And the plural for dermal papilla, so if you're referring to more than one dermal papilla, you say dermal papillae. So you have one extra letter, which means that you have more than one dermal papilla. Now, all this is the dermis. And the dermis is subdivided into two layers. So let's put an imaginary line right here. This is the top layer of the dermis, and here we have the bottom layer of the dermis. Now, guys, the top layer of the dermis is in contact. It includes the dermal papilla. Consequently, the top layer of the dermis is named papillary layer. It has the word papilla in it. And the bottom layer of the dermis is named reticular layer. Now, the reticular layer is named reticular layer because it has lots of those reticular fibers, right? And reticular fibers are one of the types of fibers produced by fibroblasts. And since we have lots of reticular fibers in the bottom part of the dermis, that layer was named reticular layer. Now, as I mentioned before, the dermis is connective tissue. The great majority of the dermis is dense, irregular connective tissue. And it has to be irregular so it can resist tension in all different directions. Now, do you remember what is the most famous, the most popular cell in the connective tissue? The most popular cell is the fibroblasts. And fibroblasts were named fibroblasts because they produce fibers. So obviously, if we have fibroblasts in the dermis, we will have the production of reticular fibers, collagen fibers, and elastic fibers. And depending on the area of the body, we will have a different arrangement, a different amount of each of these fibers. Now, what we need to remember, which is very, very important, that I already said so many times, is that since the dermis is a connective tissue, it will have blood vessels. So, blood vessels are found in connective tissue, because connective tissue is a vascularized tissue. And here you have a very good view of the blood vessels found in the dermis. And you can see that the reticular layer as well as the papillary layer, they have blood vessels, obviously, because both of these layers of the dermis are connective tissue. And also, when we look at the hypodermis, which is not part of the skin, then we are talking about the subcutaneous tissue, we will see blood vessels as well. You can see all of them here. Remember, the hypodermis is underneath the dermis. Hypo means below. And in the hypodermis, we have lots of adipocytes. We have lots of adipose tissue. And adipose tissue is also one type of connective tissue. Consequently, it is vascularized.